Um, Good evening. I'm Sean O'Hara. I'm the director of the UI Museum of Art. We have a wonderful program tonight. It is the first in our Smart Talks presentation of the year. First things first, the announcement of the new museum site will be in 24 hours. So I can't tell you now, but the Board of Regents meeting will address it, and then we can make it public. So now we've got that out of the way. All right. The Museum Smart Talks are designed to be inspiring, informative, challenging discussions between leaders of the art world and our community. We hope that this series will attract and appeal to a broad audience. The museum world encompasses a vast array of collections, professions, areas of expertise, academic, commercial pursuits, legal, ethical considerations, and physical spaces such as new buildings. Through Smart Talks, we hope to share these topics and more. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank Jan Weissmiller from Prairie Heights Bookstore and Maeve Clark and the wonderful staff at the Iowa City Public Library for partnering with the UIMA to make this event possible. And if you'd like to support any upcoming talks, see me afterwards. Yvonne Szafran is Senior Conservator and Head of Paintings Conservation for the J. Paul Getty Museum, where she's worked since 1978. She was born in Cambridge, England, then moved as a young girl to Exeter, a nice cathedral city, and then moved as still a young girl to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And she eventually studied art history, studio art, and chemistry at the University of Southern California and at the University of California, Los Angeles. She's been guest conservator both at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston from 85 to 86 and the Yale University Art Gallery in 1999. Last fall, she served on the International Scientific Committee for the Conference of Painting Techniques, History, Materials, and Studio Practice at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And she was an invited speaker for upcoming international conference on Rembrandt at the National Gallery in London. She's worked with many of the paintings in the Getty's collection and at other museums around the world, including the works of Rembrandt, Giorgione, Titian, Cezanne, Renoir, Picasso. And I can attest to this because they litter her conservation studio when we visited the Pollock Mural. Yvonne led the conservation team at the J. Paul Getty Museum during the recently concluded 2-year treatment of Jackson Pollock's mural. Not only did this process transform the painting, as you will see later tonight, but also resulted in a lasting friendship between our institutions and our staff and our supporters, for which we are very grateful. So please join me in welcoming Yvonne Szafran.
Thank you, Sean, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to all my hosts here in Iowa. I've had a really interesting visit, short, but it's exciting for me. It's the home of this fantastic painting. You're all so lucky to have it here in Iowa in a public collection. And I feel really fortunate to have spent the last 2 years with it. And so I'm here tonight to share with you some of what we learned about the painting, to review what we already knew before it came. And I thought I'd start with this wonderful quote from Clement Greenberg, who was a critic writing around the time that mural was painted. And he said, "I took one look at it and I thought, now that's great art. And I knew Jackson was the greatest painter this country had produced." And I think that gives you some idea of what kind of esteem this picture is held in. I'm going to try and give this talk without notes, but from time to time I am going to look at my iPad where my notes are, being very modern. The paintings of Jackson Pollock are among the most important, of course, of 20th century art, part of the major shift away from representational painting towards the abstract. Commissioned in 1943 by Peggy Guggenheim for her New York townhouse, Jackson Pollock's monumental painting Mural is considered a transitional moment in this shift. Again, another critic writing at the time when this painting was shown to the public for the first time in 1945 critic Manny Farber called it an almost incredible success, a wild abstraction 20 feet long commissioned by Miss Peggy Guggenheim for the hallway of her home. It is violent in its expression, endlessly fascinating in detail, without superficiality, and so well ordered that it composes the wall in a quiet, contained, buoyant way. And after living with the painting for the last 2 years, I think I feel the same way about it. You're probably wondering, how did this picture come to the Getty? How did we get involved with this project? And it's really an idea that was instigated by the former director of the Iowa Art Museum, Pamela White, who approached my colleague, Tom Lerner, at the Getty Conservation Institute about 4 years ago about this picture. She knew that it needed attention. And Tom, at the time, was in charge of a research group at the Conservation Institute called the Modern Paints Project. So the Getty is slightly a complex place in that the umbrella organization is the J. Paul Getty Trust, and the museum, whom I work for, is one branch of that trust. Also, part of the trust is the Getty Conservation Institute, and this always confuses people because we're conservators, but we work for the museum. The Getty Conservation Institute also has conservators in it, but they don't actually treat objects at the Getty. They are involved in many projects around the world, and they also do a lot of research. They also work with us. They do the more sophisticated scientific research for all of our projects. But Tom called me up, and he said, wouldn't it be interesting if our two departments did a formal project together? And I said, actually, that would be interesting, because for most of my career, I have worked on paintings up till about 1900. And Tom has worked on pictures, 20th century pictures. So I said, well, what do you have in mind? And he said, well, there's this painting in Iowa by Pollock. And I said, how large is it? Exactly. So when he told me, I tried to imagine how big this picture was. It's 8 feet by 20. It's two and a half Cooper Minis. And so my first response actually was not very positive. But after speaking with our senior curator at the time, Scott Schaefer, who said to me, look, this is a painting in need. Iowa doesn't have a conservation department. Who better than the Getty to take this on? We can do the work, we can do the research, and we can really bring attention to this very important painting. And so I agreed. And before I go on to tell you about the research that we did and the work that we did, I just want to thank all kinds of people. And I'm not going to mention all of these people by name, but you can imagine that a painting of this size requires a huge number of people working on it, just even to move the picture. Here you see a photograph of its arrival at the Getty and the kind of team that it took to move it. But so there were all kinds of colleagues at the Getty involved in this. And of course, the core team working on the project. You see Tom Lerner, who I mentioned earlier, on the left with Alan Phoenix, the other scientist working on the project. And in my own department, Laura Rivers, who did a substantial amount of the hands-on work on the painting. We also received a Mellon Foundation grant to hold a series of focus meetings on the painting as we were doing the work, which allowed us to invite a number of conservators, scholars, art historians, curators to the Getty for very focused meetings to discuss some of the more difficult issues that we were facing during the course of the treatment. And here you see a photograph of one of those meetings. And so again, I thank colleagues, not only who came to the meeting, but colleagues around the world, because this really prompted a new study within our field of looking at early paintings by Jackson Pollock. And that work is still ongoing at a number of major museums. And I think we'll see the treatment and study of Mural has prompted really a really in-depth look at Pollock's early working methods. So first, I thought I would talk a little bit about the information that came with the painting when we agreed to take it on, and that is the commission, the creation, and the early history of Mural. A lot has been written about Mural over the years, and before the painting came, we started gathering all that material, some of it published, some of it on the web. Peggy Guggenheim wrote 3 different autobiographies with stories about Mural, all of which are slightly different. Lee Krasner told stories about it, and those stories are related by other people. So it came with this tremendous amount of stories, essentially, is what they were. And it was our job to try and sift through these stories and find the truth. Here's the patron, Peggy Guggenheim, in this very famous photograph of her later. This is after she's gone back to Europe and settled in Venice, as we know, and started the museum, the basis for the museum that's there now. But of course, at the time of our story, she was living in New York. She had left Europe because the war had broken out. She stayed in Paris, actually, for quite some time, only leaving really when she had to. She was busy collecting works of art. She had thrown herself into the art world of that time. She knew many famous artists, and she was really an important figure in this moment. And I think her importance in the story of art at that time is not fully acknowledged. And in fact, I know there's a new documentary coming out just on Peggy. But so here she is, and she lived in New York in a townhouse, and she had a number of really astute advisors. And one of them said to her, there's this young artist named Jackson Pollock. Now, at the time, Jackson was very young. He was not famous at all. He was not making a living at his art. He was painting, but he was certainly not a well-known figure. She was very brave. She put him on retainer, agreed to pay him $150 a month if he produced, and she promised him a one-man exhibition at the end of a certain period if he produced enough paintings. And she also commissioned him to paint a painting for the entrance hall of her New York townhouse. And here we see a floor plan of that townhouse. And you can see exactly where, let's see, how does this work? I've forgotten how to get the pointer. Oh, here. So you can see it's exactly this wall that Mural was intended for. So here's the entrance to her apartment. I think I can see it. Okay, this is the window, so lit by one window. Here's the door. You would have walked in here, walked down this hallway to take either the elevator or the stairs up to her apartment, and on the way you would have passed Mural. Now, Jackson was very, very excited about this commission. It was a major event in his life. And what's wonderful is that we have a number of letters and postcards that he wrote to his family about it. So here we see a postcard, for example, that he wrote to his future wife, Lee Krasner, to tell her about the commission. And he says, I have signed the contract and have seen the wall space for the mural. It's all very exciting. And I should say that all of these documents or most of these documents are in the Archives of American Art in Washington. So if you're interested in seeing them, their website and their institution is wonderful at sharing these things. He also wrote a letter to his brother, Charles. And he said, I have a year's contract with Art of the Century and a large painting to do for Peggy Guggenheim's house. 8 feet 11 and a half inches and 19 feet 9 inches, with no strings as to what or how I paint it. I am going to paint it in oil, on canvas. They are giving me a show November 16th, and I want to have the painting finished for the show. I've had to tear out the partition between the front and middle room to get the damned thing up. I have it stretched now. It looks pretty big, but exciting as all hell. And which is quite amazing that, so he had to take this wall out to get the canvas stretched. And we know from later tellings by Lee Krasner that they took the material of the wall out in buckets. So whether this was done legally or not, not so sure. But you could imagine how this project really took over his home. This is his home at this point because he, as I said, he was not a successful artist at this point. He's working out of his home, not a separate studio. And of course, there are stories about him having painter's block, if you will, writer's block. He stretched this huge canvas. It's the biggest painting he's ever embarked upon, and then he doesn't know what to paint. So we'll talk a little bit about those stories later. But in the middle of painting it, he stops and either takes these 3 photographs or has somebody take them. We're absolutely convinced that these were taken in his apartment because if we go back and look here, if the painting's set up here and you stood all the way back here, it would be really hard to get the painting in one shot. And hence we have these 3 shots. And we spent a long time looking at these photographs. We don't actually know who took them or where the negatives are. So if anybody recognizes these photos, let me know afterwards, because we'd love to see the negatives. And here's a sort of imaginary view of how the painting looked in that space. And it must have been really incredible to arrive at Peggy's apartment and walk by this amazing picture. But there were stories about its installation as well. So Jackson has this canvas. He doesn't know what to paint. If you listen to Peggy or Lee Krasner, he painted this painting all in one night. This is one of the myths and stories that I mentioned that we'll address in a little while. But he also somehow got the dimensions wrong of this space. And we're not quite sure who got the dimensions wrong. Who gave him did he go and measure the space? But at any rate, when he was finished with the painting, he had to take it off the stretcher and roll it up to take it across town to Peggy's apartment. And when he got there, it didn't fit. And so the story is that Marcel Duchamp, who was one of Peggy's advisors, cut some inches off one side of the painting. So this was another story that we wanted to look at during the course of our study. And here, of course, is Peggy with Pollock in front of the picture. This is the only photograph we have, in fact, of the painting actually installed in her apartment. So we know that it got to her apartment by mid-November because she holds a party in his honor. So if any of you saw the film Pollock, starring Ed Harris, you know that another story is that he painted the painting in one kind of drunken night for a New Year's Eve party. And in fact, we know from her letters that that's not true. But again, another one of those stories that's been told over and over again. Also, an interesting thing to look at in this photograph is that it looks as if the painting is framed. And we'll come back to that in a little while as well. The painting leaves in 1947. It leaves her apartment. She moves back to Europe. And by this point, Pollock is famous because of the painting and because of the shows that she's been giving him. And Pollock has this portrait of himself taken at Vogue Studios by Herbert Matter, a well-known photographer, to sort of document his ownership of the picture. And what's interesting to realize in looking at this picture is that the painting isn't signed yet. It's not signed, it's not dated. It's on its way to a very important show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and Pollock only signs and dates it when it goes on into that public view. Here we see it in that exhibition, large-scale modern paintings, early 1947, and we see it hanging in both paintings next to Picasso and Leger. And it was really made a huge impression in the art world. It was the second largest painting in the exhibition. And it really clinched Pollock's position as a leading painter of his time. The painting then went to Yale University, and we know that from correspondence, but we have no images of the painting while it was at Yale. It was offered to Yale as a donation, and they turned it down, but we know they put it on view. The little information we were able to glean from Yale was that, in fact, it wasn't well received there by the students. And it languished in storage for quite some time there, and Peggy found out she wasn't happy. And that is how she came to offer it to Iowa, who wisely accepted the donation. Although it took quite a while for the picture to come from Yale to Iowa, because there was disagreement about the cost of shipping, which ranged anywhere from $40 to $100. And there's this early transient history, if you will, of the picture took a toll on it, because each time it moved, it was taken off its stretcher and rolled up for transport, and then unrolled and restretched. This is fairly common for a large picture, but not necessarily always a great thing for a painting's condition. So now I'm going to review a little bit about what we know about that condition. If we go back and look at this famous photograph, which I think I showed earlier, this is a phenomenal photograph of Pollock in front of the stretched canvas of Mural before he starts to paint. So he knew at this point that this was a big, important commission, and he wanted to document himself in front of the picture. But if you look very closely at the bottom edge, you can see already that the canvas, that the stretcher is starting to sag in the middle, both here and here. And we can even, when we look at the installation shot of the exhibition that I already talked about at MoMA, we can see that the painting is sagging already. It's making this kind of a shape. Because the stretcher, the wooden structure that Pollock stretched the canvas on, wasn't strong enough. Here we see a report, a conservation report that MoMA wrote before the picture went to Yale University, where they were pointing out various problems on the picture, flaking areas and damages. But more importantly, Margaret Miller at MoMA writes to Yale and says, I should warn you that the canvas is warped in the center in such a way that it can never be stretched true again. So this is really part of the painting at this point, this funny shape. And the picture goes back to MoMA in 1967 for the big retrospective at that time. And in fact, when it's there, the conservators become very alarmed, because not only is the stretcher weak and sagging, but the paint is starting to flake. And they're quite concerned about it. And you can see again that the distortion inherent in the picture. So in 1973, the University of Iowa decides to hire a conservator to treat the picture. And that treatment probably saves the picture. But it also introduces two major problems for us today, or for us 2 years ago. The first thing they do is line the picture. And what that means is they took the painting off of its stretcher and they glued another piece of canvas onto the back of the original to sort of strengthen it, to introduce an adhesive, in this case a wax resin mixture, to seep through the original canvas and to hold onto those bits of flaking paint. It was a very standard procedure at the time. It's not a standard procedure anymore, because we know now that that kind of operation involves heat and pressure, which isn't necessarily good for the paint. It consolidates the paint, but it also has the capability of flattening the paint. And it's an irreversible procedure because it's using wax. And if any of you have had wax candles dripping onto a tablecloth, you know that once that wax is in the fabric, it's very hard to get out. So they lined it. But at the same time, as I said, it probably saved the painting because it stopped the paint from flaking off. But in lining it, the conservator wasn't quite sure how to deal with this sagging shape. So, and what kind of stretcher was he going to put it on after he had finished the lining? He chose to put it on a rectangular stretcher, and in doing so, he introduced a problem. Let me see if the next, yes. So here you can see, marked in red on the overall photograph, where the problems are. And in the bottom image, you can see a detail of one of those problem areas. And if you look here, all of this down at the bottom is actually the tacking edge of the painting, the part of the canvas that was originally on the side of the painting, which is now on the front of the painting. And this happened here, we can see it quite clearly, here, and along the top. Now the conservator, let's see if we go back. If we go back to his notes from the time, which are in the archives here at the Art Museum, he recognized this. He said this meant exposing considerable areas of white primed surfaces, which formerly had been turned under on its stretcher frame. It was decided that the unpainted exposed surfaces could be carefully masked out in the reframing process. So he thought that the painting was going to be framed, but of course it wasn't originally framed. And if we go back to that photograph of the painting in its original installation, what appears to be a frame is actually, and I'm just going to hop back here quickly if I can, as I forgot to, this one. I forgot to put in another copy of this. But if we look at this, what seems to be a frame, we now know is not a frame. It's the architectural molding in the building that was there at the beginning. And the way that we know this is that even though Mural moved, the building itself stayed fairly intact until the 80s, when, in fact, the Mellon Foundation bought the building. And as part of their renovation, one of the people who was working there at the time knew about the history of this picture, wanted to document the space, took photos of the space, and we now can recognize that that is actually architectural molding. So we know the painting wasn't framed originally. It was framed when it was in this exhibition, but that was done by the Museum of Modern Art. We assume with Pollock's permission, but we don't know. And even then, the frame that they put on the painting didn't cover the edges. So the conservator, thinking that this could be framed out, it's a difficult thing, although it is something that we discussed, you'll see later, but quickly ruled out. So the painting was lined, these problem areas introduced, and the other thing the conservator did at the time was he varnished the painting. That is, he put a clear coat of a synthetic resin on the surface of the painting to protect it. Again, this was standard practice for the time period, not something we would do today with a picture that wasn't varnished originally. Jackson Pollock didn't varnish Mural originally. He didn't generally varnish his paintings. He liked the surface effects he achieved with unvarnished paint, mixing both glossy and matte paints, different textures. So the varnish had the effect, even though it hadn't discolored, it had the effect of really veiling the qualities that Jackson wanted to present. And the conservator also used a varnish that we now know doesn't have such wonderful aging properties. So this was all in the records of the picture, of course, before we started the work. We knew that we were going to have to take the varnish off, But I think we said to everybody that, in fact, we weren't sure it was going to make a huge visual difference. This is the painting, how as it looked when it arrived at the Getty with that varnish on, and you can see it's somewhat hard. Well, this isn't actually specular light, but you can see the reflective qualities of the painting, and the varnish had this smoothing out effect on the picture. Before I go on, I wanted to show a film of the painting arriving at the Getty. Can I turn up the sound? So here we see the painting arriving at the Getty in our art elevator. You can see it's really stretched us to our full capability as it's traveling on an angle. And here's the studio where the picture lived for almost 2 years, my studio, and the unpacking of the painting from its travel frame. You can see what an operation it is just to move it. It lived on this sort of temporary mounting apparatus. And that, I think, that image there really shows you the sort of milky quality that the colors had when it arrived. And that is how it looked before we started the treatment. And I'm also showing the back before we started the treatment, because this is the stretcher now, not the original stretcher, but the stretcher that the conservator put the painting on in 1973. And in fact, that stretcher had also cracked, also weak, like the original stretcher. We don't really know what the original stretcher looked like, but it must have been similar to this. So we knew at the beginning of our treatment that we were going to have to replace this stretcher in some way. So now I'm going to talk about what we did. And as I said earlier, it was a joint project of the museum and the Getty Conservation Institute. What were our goals? We wanted, well, of the treatment itself, we wanted to remove the surface grime and the dirt that had accumulated on the painting. We wanted to remove that 1973 varnish and recover a surface that was closer to what Pollock intended. We wanted to improve the structural integrity of the painting with a new stretcher. And we wanted to consider how the aesthetic issue of the visible tacking margins that I showed you earlier might be addressed. Before we start work on any picture in the studio, we spend a fair amount of time examining it and studying it. And this is exactly what we did with Mural. We looked at it under the microscope. We looked at it with magnifiers very closely. We looked at it in all kinds of different light. We took all kinds of photographs, transmitted light photographs, photographs taken with infrared sensitive cameras, ultraviolet light. We took an X-ray. We try and learn as much about the painting as possible so that when we actually go to treat it, nothing is really a surprise. And what we discovered is that the actual condition of the paint of Mural was actually quite sound. That 1973 lining had actually done its job. There was very little fragile paint on the surface, although there was some. We felt good about that. We felt that the lining itself, even though it wasn't something we would have done, was doing its job, and we weren't terribly anxious to remove that lining. Sometimes that is done with paintings that have been lined that shouldn't have been. We'll remove those linings to try and return to a more sympathetic surface. But in this case, we felt actually, knowing that this painting was going to travel, we felt actually that the lining should stay. Here you see two of us removing some of that surface grime that I talked about. And again, this is just the beginning of our cleaning. We're getting to know the surface. We carefully remove bits of surface grime off the surface using cotton swabs rolled very carefully over the surface with an aqueous solution. And if you look at the swab itself, you can see it's not terribly dirty, But there is some dirt coming off in that process. Removing the varnish, the 1973 varnish, was a little more difficult. Because we knew what kind of varnish it was, we knew what the best solvent was going to be. It was a great solvent for the painting, but a terrible one for human beings. And we tried very, very hard to find something else that might work as well. And we weren't able to, but we spent a fair number of weeks trying that. Cleaning any painting, you're always relying on the solubility of the varnish in relation to the solubility of the paint film. And because this is a fairly new paint film, our decisions were a little bit more difficult than with an older painting. So we ended up using the solvent that we didn't want to use, which required us to use masks and several layers of gloves. But the varnish came off really nicely, and the paint was really happy. And I love this photograph. If you look closely, you'll see the director of the museum and the president of the Getty Trust in this photograph. This was taken at one of the many meetings of experts that we had around the painting. And what it nicely illustrates is how difficult it was to look at the painting when the varnish was still on it. You couldn't stand in front of the painting and take the whole thing in. You found yourself kind of moving positions all the time because of the reflections. And then once we took the varnish off, it really changed much more dramatically than I think any of us expected. So if you look at the images on the right, you see the upper image, which is the before of a detail of the painting with the varnish on it. And then the image below that is without the varnish. And I think I don't need to tell you what a dramatic change that is. The the dark paints became darker, the reds and yellows, all the colors became brighter. You didn't have that reflection anymore, and you became much more aware of the variety of the surface. And this variety of the surface is a really hard thing to document in photographs. So I think these are great. It's really hard to document this picture to show that. But at the time of the cleaning, right after we cleaned the painting, we invited our local critic, Christopher Knight, who writes for the Los Angeles Times. He's a really tough critic. And he had come to see the painting when it first arrived. He wanted to see how the painting looked after it was cleaned. And I think what he says actually sums it up. And I wouldn't normally be so arrogant to put such a complimentary review up here. But I think actually what he says is right. It's to be expected that a newly cleaned painting will look somewhat different than it had, but I was frankly unprepared for just how different, how fresh and kinetic Mural looks now. Color contrasts are emphatic. Patches of white canvas are bright rather than dim, while wholly abstract, several flickering suggestions of animal forms are vivid. Layers of visual space have opened up, created by what the artist called his stampede of painterly shapes and rhythms. The gestural dynamism known to have had such an impact almost 70 years ago when the commissioned painting was first unveiled in collector Peggy Guggenheim's Manhattan apartment has returned in force. My jaw dropped. The veil of varnish had tamped everything down. Perhaps its most detrimental effect was the uniform sheen of reflected light across the surface that it had caused. In hindsight, Mural looked less like a painting than like a giant photo mural of a painting. Not anymore. Mural is back. I think in my entire career, I don't think I've ever been so publicly, or any of us have been so publicly acknowledged. It was rewarding. The next thing we had to deal with were these problematic edges, of course, and what to do about Mural's weak stretcher. And here is the painting before we as it arrived, as I said, with these problematic areas, again, pointed out. What were we going to do? And this topic is really what consumed our meetings of conservators and curators and art historians. This was the thing that we talked about the most. because it was a difficult decision. First of all, to decide what was right, and second of all, to see, well, could we do it? So our first option was to make a new stretcher, but similarly a rectangular stretcher, like the one that it had arrived on. That would make a nice, strong structure for the painting, but it wouldn't help us deal with the issues that I've discussed. Our second option was to put it on a shaped stretcher. Now, this might seem like a strange idea, but this is actually something that's done in our field fairly often. It's not something that you would probably notice going through a museum, that a painting might be on a shaped stretcher. Certainly old master paintings, the way we would deal with this is to actually frame that kind of problem out. But because, and we did actually discuss putting a frame on the painting, but because we now knew that the painting hadn't been framed originally, and even when it was framed for the MoMA show, it wasn't a frame that covered the edges, we actually quickly got rid of that option. To help us try and make this decision, we actually made a one-to-one photographic mock-up of the painting that we took down to the exhibition design studio in the museum. And we put it up on the wall the way it was. And then we cut these bits off with a knife and put it back up on the wall. And that was really interesting. But then we decided, well, we're just dealing with a one-dimensional photograph. That's not really telling us what the painting would really look like. So we built up the photograph to have the same depth as the painting, and we looked at it again. And we invited different people down to look at it with us, artists and art historians and other conservators, and really almost anybody we could trap down there to discuss this dilemma with us. We decided to go with the shaped stretcher, which both excited us and terrified us, frankly, because it's one thing to say, yes, that's the right approach. It's another thing to then say, okay, now we have to talk the painting into letting us put it on a shaped stretcher. How were we going to do this? So we put the painting on flat, on a table, in a horizontal position, face up, and tried to decide where that new edge was going to be. Where was the original turnover edge? And this wasn't actually a simple operation because I think, as I described earlier, the painting had been rolled and unrolled each time it went from those different locations, which meant that every time it was stretched onto the stretcher, there was a slightly different turn to those edges. And so we spent a long time looking at that edge and tracing on a piece of mylar what we felt was the intended edge, Pollock's intended edge. And I actually left out a part of something that we discussed, but maybe I'll come back to it. At any rate, we traced the edge, and then we had a dummy stretcher made, if you will. We're lucky at the Getty in that we have professional woodworkers on staff who worked really closely with us on this project. And I don't think we could have done this without them. If we'd had to farm this work out, we wouldn't have had that close working relationship. They made this dummy stretcher for us out of wood, and we kept trying it on the painting once we'd established that edge, and then sending it back and saying, no, take a little more off this, or take a little more off that. But we also had the painting itself to deal with. You'll remember that the painting's lined, which means there's 2 layers of fabric there, not just the one original layer. So here you see the corner of the painting. Here's the back of the original canvas, and here's the lining. Now, to try and teach 2 layers of fabric, a new but old original turnover, is not so easy. So we decided to separate the 2 out just to where the paint starts, which was a tricky thing to do. We didn't want to introduce any delamination in the paint structure, in the painting structure itself, but only on the edges so that we could turn one edge at a time. And at this point in the process, we were really glad that it was a wax lining, because what that meant is that the adhesive itself responded to mild heat. So it made this kind of operation actually feasible and doable. But we still didn't know if the painting was going to agree to this shape. It hadn't been in that shape for quite some time. As we were doing this work, we kept checking the front of the painting. Anytime you have a painting face down, even though you've prepared your surface, you've cushioned it nicely, you know there's no dirt on there, you have the painting face down. You can't see the paint anymore. It's rather stressful. So as we were fiddling with these edges, we wanted to make sure that everything was still good there. So we kept checking with mirrors. It's kind of a low-tech thing to do, but it works really well. Here you see are those professional woodworkers that I was mentioning in their shop building this new fabulous stretcher. We decided to build it out of Alaskan cedar, which is thought I had that written down, which is a fabulous, very strong but light wood. We in that structure we also introduced a very, very thin layer of something called dye bond, which is 2 layers of aluminum with polyethylene in between, because we wanted to give the stretcher some structure, and we also wanted to give the painting a surface onto which it could rest, especially when it's traveling. Here you see some photographs of that process happening, introducing the new stretcher. We had to then mount the painting on its new stretcher, but because we'd gone through this long process of getting the stretcher to be exactly the right profile, when we turned the painting back face up, because we wanted to stretch it face up, to make sure that we got that turnover edge right, it was perfect. And it took a whole team of us to stretch it, or to mount it back on the stretcher, I should say. We're not really stretching it, we're placing it. And then we did some in-painting. As I said, there wasn't a huge amount of paint loss on the surface. There was a little bit. We did some retouching on the surface, as well as the edges. I think the edges really had the most loss. And some people would say, well, now why are you retouching the edges when you were so anxious to get them out of view? But in fact, when the painting is hanging, you do, of course, if you're looking at it from the edge, you see the edges. So it was important for us that those look the way they had when it left Pollock's studio. And we use materials that appear like the original, but are much more stable than the original, and don't discolor. And if anybody ever wants to take our work off, they can do very easily. And here you see the painting after our conservation treatment hanging in the exhibition. Before I go on to talk about the exhibition, I thought I would talk a little bit as well about what we learned about Pollock's materials and techniques, because that was really the other component of our research and project while the picture was at the Getty. We wanted to try and answer some of those questions that had circulated around the picture, to see if we could bring any light to the matter. Our main questions: how long did it take Pollock to paint Mural? Did he paint it in one night? We don't think so. And I'll go on to show you why. How did Pollock apply the paint? Was he working in a different way that anticipates his later drip paintings, which of course he then becomes quite famous for? And what kind of paint did he use? How long did it take him to paint it? Well, I think all of us feel very comfortable in saying that it took him at least a matter of weeks, if not months, to paint Mural. One way that we have of looking at paint is that we'll take tiny samples, no bigger really than the head of a pin, of paint from areas of damage, and mount them in a block of resin, and then carefully grind that sample down until under the microscope we can see a cross-section of the paint layers. And these are 2 cross-sections from 2 different places on the painting. Most of them looked like this one on the left. So these are all individual paint layers, and you can see how sharp the line is between each layer of paint. And most of the paints on this painting are oil paint. Oil paint doesn't dry quickly. There is absolutely no way this could have been done in a 24-hour period. It would look much more like this. This is from an area of the painting where it's obvious that the underneath paint was wet before the paint on top was put on. And this is what you get in cross-sectional form, this really mixing of the paint swirling together. So most of the materials Pollock used to paint Mural were actually quite traditional. He came out of traditional training, and he's using traditional materials. He's painting on a very high-quality Belgian linen canvas, stretched on a wooden stretcher, very traditional makeup. The paints, the canvas itself has 2 layers of ground. It came that way from the manufacturer, a lead white ground and a zinc ground on top, very typical for that time. Most of the paints are high-quality artist's oil paint. We don't know what manufacturer, but very high quality, with very few extenders or fillers or adulterants. I'll go on because there's one exception to that. But if we go back to this image, there was one paint that caught our attention right away that we were convinced was in fact not oil paint. And that is this pink paint that's been splattered on the picture plane. And we became convinced early on that this was not oil paint, that must be Pollock experimenting early on with some kind of enamel paint. And much to our disappointment, it's oil paint. We were completely off base. We got completely sidetracked. But what we did wonder is, well, did he change the makeup of the paint in any way to be able to achieve this effect without putting the canvas flat on the ground, as he does later with his drip paintings? So we spent some time making mock-ups. Aside from all the scientific analysis, sometimes it's really useful to try and copy what the artist did. And in doing this, we discovered that if you add a little stand oil or thickened oil to the oil paint, you can get a very substantive mixture and achieve exactly these kind of shapes by flinging the paint. Here you see them flinging the paint with the painting flat, but we could get it even closer when we put the canvas vertically, and we got very similar shapes to what Pollock had achieved here. So we feel pretty comfortable that the canvas never went flat in his studio, that he threw the paint, and that he must have added something to that pink paint to give it that thickness and body. But it's still oil paint. We studied all the different pigments that he used, and as I said, most of the paint was oil paint with very high quality pigments. One color in particular, though, was kind of interesting. And of course, I don't have an image of the painting here. If we look at the painting here, this blue-green color that you see across the painting is actually interesting in that it's a mixture of almost all of the other colors that Pollock must have mixed up while he was painting a large amount. It appears in different places in the cross-section, but it's always kind of the same. You see it here and here, low down. So that's kind of interesting, and we've since observed it on other pictures by him, this kind of mixed up gray-green color. But there was another paint that we missed at the beginning that actually turned out to be the most interesting one. And this is this transparent white color that turns out to be not oil paint at all, a water-based paint, probably a house paint. It's a casein paint. That is, it's pigment mixed with milk protein. Very, very common at the time as a house paint. So why Pollock used it on the painting. We're not quite sure. His use of it in the painting is actually quite interesting, and we'll see a map of it later. He uses it to bring back white areas in the picture during one of his editing phases. But that was a real surprise. How did we learn all of this? We had different scientific methods that we used, aside from taking these tiny samples of paint. We did some really phenomenal new kind of imaging on the painting. What you see here are 5 results from something called hyperspectral imaging, which allows you to look at the painting in different wavelengths of light, ranging all the way from visible light up through the near infrared. And each various components of the different colors will map differently at different points. And in the case of the casein house paint, the fillers in that paint had very specific response in one wavelength. So here we get a map. This is showing you that the dark patches are everywhere that casein house paint is used. So you can see that it was a very important part of his process as he was painting. And it really does occur, it isn't just one moment in time, because it occurs at different campaigns of painting. So it's quite an interesting discovery. We also did something called macro XRF scanning. And this is a technique that uses something that we've used for a long time, XRF, X-ray fluorescence, that will gives us the ability to identify inorganic components in the paint. But now some scientists in the Netherlands have developed this piece of equipment that allows us to scan a whole painting rather than doing just point analysis. The only problem with this type of scanning at this point is that it takes a very long time. And so to do a small area of the painting takes over 24 hours. So rather than do the whole painting, we decided to just choose a couple of areas on Mural, because if you take one area of Mural like this, you get almost every color that's on the painting. And so this is one of the areas that we chose to scan. And here are some of the results from that scan. It's really fantastic. You can see the vermilion, for example. Here, by mapping the mercury element, for example, we can see exactly where he used vermilion. And it really helped us to unpack those paint layers and to try and understand the order in which he put paint down. I'm not going to go into detail about this because a lot of this is included in the book, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to read those sections. The exhibition opened in March at the Getty, and I'm happy to say that it has set a record. It's been our most popular exhibition ever held at the Getty Center, which is, I think, surprised all of us. In its short run, it was only on view for something like 10 weeks. It received over 300,000 visitors. And over 85% of every person who came to the Getty went to see the exhibition. It was a 2-room exhibition too, which is and people lined up to get in. And the exhibition itself had 2 entrances. One, if you just wanted to see the painting, you could go in and just look at the painting. And here you see that entrance. But there was another entrance too, where if you wanted to approach it from seeing all of our findings first, you could enter the exhibition that way too. And that's the entrance that you see on the upper left. What was really rewarding during the run of the show was to go up there and see how people were looking at it all. And generally they did go and look at the painting first, which was great. Then they would go into the secondary gallery and look at all of the work, some of which I've been presenting to you today. And then they would go back into the other gallery and look at the painting some more. And that was really the best testament to us of the work that we had done. We had really helped to make this fantastic picture accessible to the public. Here's, again, are some more shots. We also included, as part of the exhibition, 3 videos, one focusing on the paint analysis, one focusing on the paint application, and one focusing on the conservation treatment. Each one of those videos is 2 minutes long, and they will live on. They're on the Getty's website, and you can also find them on YouTube. If you just Google Getty and Pollock, you'll come to them. They're really well done and really informative. Jackson Pollock later said in his application for a grant, he said, "I intend to paint large movable pictures which will function between the easel and the mural. I have set a precedent in this genre in a large painting for Miss Peggy Guggenheim, which was installed in her house. I believe the easel picture to be a dying form, and the tendency of the modern feeling is toward the wall picture or mural." I think that having had the privilege of working on this great picture for the last 2 years, I think you were all very lucky to have it, when it comes home here to Iowa, to have it always in your state. And again, if any of you are more interested in what I've been talking about tonight, a lot of this is in the book. Did I ramble on too much? What time is it?
Take some questions.
Okay.
Take some questions.
Okay.
So we're gonna take some questions, and we have a mic up at the front. Right. Okay. So who would like to pose the first question?
Did you apply any protection to cover the picture?
No, we did not. The standard thinking now in our field is that if an artist didn't varnish his painting originally, then we are not going to put a varnish on it. And there's been a great move in all major museums to unvarnish pictures that were wrongly varnished back in the 70s. And the idea that a varnish is a protective layer to a painting is a little bit false. It's a very thin layer. It doesn't really offer any kind of much protection at all.
Another question up here. One up here. No?
Where?
Okay. Yeah. There you go.
I'm just curious about the frame. Why use wood again? Why not a metal?
You mean the stretcher?
I'm sorry, the stretcher. Given that the humidity affects wood, and you could make something that would be much more substantial, and yet.
That's a good question. I think within our field, we like to think that the work that we do on a picture is sympathetic with the artist's original intent. The artist originally used wood, but I agree with you, we wanted it to be strong, and that is why we introduced the dye bond, to add a little bit of structure. The wood we chose is very, very stable. I'm not worried about the wood changing in response to humidity. But so visually, we still have the wood, we still have the material that Pollock used, but we've strengthened it a bit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A question all the way to the back and front here.
Good. I'll work my way back. How about that?
Okay. I just wanted to check, did they find that they did actually trim some of the length?
That was the part I left out. I realized when I got to the end of the talk, now how did I not talk about that? Did I not have an image? Did I show an image?
We have the piece up back here.
At any rate, when we were cleaning the picture, and this had been observed by scholars when the painting went to MoMA in '98 for the Great Pollock retrospective, there had been a lot of study of the picture at that time. And it had been suggested at that time that, in fact, maybe what happened, maybe the cutting story is this. Maybe the canvas wasn't cut. Maybe the stretcher was cut. And when we were cleaning the painting, we uncovered a series of tack holes on the right side that were just about this much into the painting. So our thinking is, the possibility is that the stretcher was cut and not the canvas, and then the canvas would have been kind of turned around, tacked down, and wedged into that space. Now, when it went to MoMA, it would have been taken off the stretcher again. Was it restretched in that way, or did they put it on a different stretcher? We don't really know. But yes, I think there probably was some truth to that story, just not how people have thought about it.
How much does the painting canvas weigh, and how much does it weigh on the stretcher now?
It's heavy, and I should know the exact number, and I've forgotten. I think we actually increased its weight by adding the stretcher we did. There was some concern that that would make the painting even harder to handle than it was already. But we want to make sure that this stretcher is going to last for a while and not break again. And we hope that after the painting travels for the next few years, once it returns to Iowa, our hope is that it not travel for a while.
Thanks. He talked about the painting as being a stampede of buffaloes and antelopes, right?
Yes.
But the movement in the painting is from right to left.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, that's how some people see it. That's how I see it.
I certainly see that right now, but
Yeah.
I just was wondering if he was being extraordinarily clever, because as you walk in the door of the apartment, you would be walking in from right to left.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yes, a number of scholars have observed that. Yeah. And the description of the painting being a stampede of animals, that story actually comes from another artist who claims that Pollock said that. Mm. But whether Pollock actually said that, we don't really know.
Great. Thanks.
One of the wonderful discoveries from that hyperspectral imaging that I showed you was that we were able to image the umber paint in the painting. And it's the umber that defines those figures that you can kind of see marching across the picture. And so if we go back to that hyperspectral image, we get a great image of just those figures, which have excited the art historians tremendously. And they're busy writing now new interpretations of the picture.
Hi, I heard you on NPR this morning, and I live in Dubuque, so I had to drive an hour and a half to get here, so I'm just grateful to be here and grateful that you're here, because I find your work absolutely fascinating. I was just curious, in terms of the chemistry of what you do, when I walked in, I kind of was in the middle of your career, and I've been discouraged about the chemistry piece, about studying conservation, because I love art, I love painting, and is that a huge deal? Is the
what's
chemistry?
Interesting is that most conservators, most of us who actually do the work on the paintings, come from an art history and studio art background. Those kind of people who study art history and studio art aren't always the kind of people that would study chemistry. So for many of us, it meant a return to rethinking chemistry, which I did as an undergraduate, and really enjoyed it. It's chemistry with a purpose in action. And once you think of it that way, then it's not so daunting. But I don't want to call myself a chemist. In no way am I a chemist. And I'm lucky that I work at the Getty, where we have real chemists and real physicists that I need to be able to talk to and understand. But I'm not actually the one doing the scientific work.
First of all, I have an Iowa-centric comment, and that is that I would have loved to have seen a picture of it hanging in the UI Art Museum, where many of us remember it. So that's just a comment. My question is about the sequence of how it ended up at the Getty. And you talk about it being saved in '73. Well, it was saved in 2008. What year was the flood? 2000. And was the Getty approached before or after the flood?
No, I think it was after the flood.
Okay, so I
think
was
it was
just
the flood that
interested in that
prompted it.
sequence of.
Yeah, I think it was the flood that prompted it.
Okay.
And the fact that the director at the time was at the Getty for another meeting and happened to meet Tom Lerner and learn about that particular research group. But I should also say that our department has a long history of working with other institutions around the world in this kind of way. Right now we are working, for example, with the Byler Foundation in Switzerland, the National Museum of Warsaw, the National Gallery of Ireland. This is an ongoing program that we have where we bring great works of art to the Getty for study and restoration. Sometimes we bring a conservator with those projects. Sometimes we don't. If the lending institution doesn't have a conservator, then they can't send one. And the payment for the Getty, if you will, is that we then display the works of art in our galleries upstairs. And so it's very enriching for our public and for our collection to have that kind of program in effect, but it also falls under the philanthropic mission of the Getty to help other institutions.
Would you be willing to share the name of the solvent that you used to remove the varnish?
You noticed I was really careful not to. Yeah. That's actually the information we don't like to share, partly because for legal reasons, because there are many people who think that if they hear what we use, that they can then go and use it on their painting, and then they get into trouble and either call us up or file suit. So that's the kind of information we don't actually share in a public fashion.
The issue of restoring a painting, sometimes there is pieces of paint missing from a painting.
Yes.
So it's a two-part question, really. First, can you discuss the aesthetic and philosophical issue of replacing paint that's missing when the artist, isn't around to do it? And did this happen with Mural?
Yes. So I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. I felt like I was getting so many slides that I took a few out, but I should have left those in. I think I said in the talk that there wasn't much paint loss on Mural, but there was some. And those areas that where the paint was missing, we did replace. This is a standard, this is something that we do on a regular basis with all paintings. It's very rare to have a painting in a museum collection that has no paint loss at all. And the way that we do it is we very carefully match our paint to the surrounding original paint, but we mix it in a special conservation paint that's quite different to the original paint, that's very stable but easily removable at any point, maybe even 100 years from now. Somebody could remove our work. We document it thoroughly. We document all of our work very thoroughly. So we take photographs at the beginning of the treatment, during the treatment, without our work on it, at the end. It's a very smart question, but it is something that we do. Most museums, I would say, around the world have this same approach at this point. There are still a few places in the world that don't, and I think it becomes a more ethically interesting question when a painting is really damaged. How much do you put back? And at a certain point, if half of a painting is missing off the surface, if we go in and replace that, aren't we making a fake at that point? So each painting is different. In the case of Mural, given its size, there was very, very minimal paint loss. But the paint loss that was there, I think if we'd left it, that might be the first thing that you would notice when you saw the painting. You would say, well, there's a scratch across the painting. Why didn't they fix it? Even if it, was just miniature little bits of paint loss. And so what our aim in any treatment that we do is that when the painting goes on view, you as the viewer, as the enjoyer of the painting, we hope that you don't look at it and say, oh, look, they just restored this picture. Didn't they do a great job? We want you to look at the painting and say, what a fantastic picture. That's our aim.
Something that I found really interesting in looking at this whole process, and in our conversation a year or so ago, and it might even have been with Sean, is how Peggy came to even know about Iowa and choose the university as the recipient of this.
I'll leave that to Sean, I think.
Well, Lester Longman was the director of the School of Art. Actually, it was eventually made the School of Art, but it was the Department of Plastic Arts. And he had spent time in New York. He was based in Princeton at one point, and he knew a lot of artists. And he was starting essentially a new program, moving the program away from Grant Wood's program, which was more referential and more about the European model, and really creating a new model to introduce pure creativity. And so he developed new degrees like the MFA. And because of that, it brought notoriety to our program. And the two programs that were leading the way at universities, because universities are different from art schools in this case, were both Iowa and Yale. And Yale came up in the story previously. And Iowa led the way because we hired professional artists as professors, which is, again, a big step, because a lot of professional artists don't have the academic qualifications, but we recognize their talents anyway. And so that's why Iowa was known. And I'm sure a lot of you know that Iowa had long-standing connections with New York. I think we were once called Greenwich Village West or something like that. So, and Philip Guston also had an important part to play, because he came in to be the painting professor after Grant Wood died. And he was from New York, and he recruited people from New York. And in fact, one other story I want to quickly mention is part of the reason why so many people came to Iowa was particularly after the war, was that it was the one major painting program that you could cover the tuition and fees with your GI Bill grant. we were affordable, basically, and artists knew that was an important part of their educational plan. So.
You've mentioned that often this painting was rolled. Now this makes me wonder how it's going to be transported between all the sites. Is
In
it going
a
to be
large
intact?
crate. The Getty actually made the crate. We have a whole department that specializes in that. And our hope is that the painting will travel very safely. You know, great works of art get shipped around the world every day. This is an especially large one, but it's not the largest. And so it will go through the normal channels. I don't anticipate any real problems.
No, not at all.
No.
So on that note, please thank Yvonne.